Hello, world history students, and welcome to this screencast on revolutionary China. The purpose of this small lecture is to help students to understand where the Chinese Communist Party, which still rules China today, came from. So, how did the history from 100 years ago to about 75 years ago lead to the creation of a communist state in the world's largest country by population? So we'll be taking a look at the period in between the world wars, much like we have in Europe with the rise of fascism, and in India with the growth of the Indian independence movement, and then here in China, where events after World War II, and then, or excuse me, after World War I, and then during World War II, had a huge effect on human history by propelling the Communist Party of China into power there. So let's go ahead and take a look at some things. 100 years ago in China, the Chinese government was a republic for the first time in its history. The person on the right, Yuan Shikai, had been part of a group of revolutionaries and also military officers who'd overthrown the last Chinese emperor. So, since 1911, little more than 100 years, China has not had an empire, and it was a republic. But that first government, led by this general, was not able to control the entire country. These other pictures show different armies and generals and bandits that controlled parts of China. So the central government of China did not control the whole country. This is sometimes called the warlord era. So if you see the blue there on the map, that was the area controlled by the national government of China. So, like the president of China, who was that general for a time, and then a succession of other people, didn't control the whole country. And these other areas, these other blobs, pink blobs on the map, were controlled by local leaders, warlords, who had their own militaries, like we saw in the last picture. It wasn't an ongoing civil war necessarily, because sometimes there was peace inside those areas, but these warlords were kind of constantly competing with each other for more influence, and the central government was not able to make people away from the capital. They weren't really able to make people do anything. So the country was fairly disunited. So China was in a excuse me, in a very difficult it was in a very difficult position. At the same time that that was happening, foreign countries, imperialists, still had influence in China. So you see the different colors there show the different areas. So it's not most of the country, as you can see by area, but it is quite a bit of it. If you look right here, this area had been the German area where Germany did. So when World War I happened, Japan was on the Allied side, and so they used the war as a chance to expand their control in China. So the Chinese then, they tried to balance the situation out by joining the Allies themselves. So after the war, the other Allied leaders, not China and Japan, but like France, the United States, and Britain, they had a problem on their hands because one Allied country, Japan, was occupying territory in another Allied country. So China, not only did the national government not control the whole country because of warlords, they also did not control it because of imperialists. The May 4th movement, then, something called the May 4th movement, was one result of this. On May 4th was when reports that the Treaty of Versailles, that was being negotiated at that time, was not going to make Japan leave China. When word of that got out, students, college students and high school students, a lot of students your age, across the country, at least in the big cities like Shanghai, which is on the left, and Beijing on the right, walked out of class, had big demonstrations. The students on the left are burning Chinese goods. So it was kind of a nationalist explosion, like, that they didn't want their country to be controlled by foreigners. Eventually, a number of the people in this movement a couple years later did form the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party is different than international communists like in Europe, in that when it started, there was kind of a nationalist bit to it. So it's a little more complex than what we saw in like Nazi Germany, where communists and nationalists were opposites. Here, there's going to be some overlap because they're both fighting against imperialists. So the Chinese Communist Party was located in initially when it formed in Shanghai, which was one of China's biggest cities and still is one of the biggest cities in the world. And they were interested in organizing workers. So that's a traditional communist idea, or like original communist idea. Karl Marx had said that the working people, like the man in the bottom left there who's being arrested, the working people would rise up against the owners. Remember, communism isn't necessarily about people making the same salary. It's about kind of eliminating salaries, getting rid of the people who, in communist eyes, don't work at all, the people who own things but don't actually do the work in the factory. So, because communism emphasized factory workers and the city working class, the Chinese Communist Party, started by basically by college students and educated people, but they wanted to be near working class people, people who worked in the city. At first, this Communist Party did cooperate with the Nationalist Party, which was another group of people, another party in China that was part of the national government, because they both wanted to get rid of the warlords who the communists felt took advantage of peasants in the countryside, and get rid of foreigners who were taking advantage of the Chinese working class, according to communists. Well, that's going to fall apart, but this is the way that communism in China has always had this sort of nationalist piece to it. And that's important because the Chinese Communist Party today in China is extremely nationalist. And that's led to a lot of the brutal things it's done, including, repressing people who aren't Chinese in China. But it also should kind of help you understand how they interact with the rest of the world, including with the United States. So in the 1920s, even though the communists were interested in the big city of Shanghai, really most people in China, by far, most people in China were peasants who lived in the countryside, especially people who did not own land. So they either had only a little bit of land, and they needed to rent more or work on some from a landlord, someone who owned the land, or they didn't have any of their own land at all. They're working on someone else's land. So, in theory, this did not make China a place where a communist revolution would happen. Because, according to the original communist theory, Karl Marx, it should be factory workers who took over the government. So, a country that hadn't industrialized yet wasn't quite where that would happen. Now, in Russia, there was a working class that had been part of the revolution. You might remember that from the posters we saw. But Russia was pretty agricultural, but China was even more agricultural. But when people who started the Chinese Communist Party saw that the Russian Revolution had been successful, I mean, it, it's successful in their eyes because it overthrew the existing government and destroyed capitalism. They began to think that maybe something could happen in China. But most Chinese people were poor peasants, even more so in Russia before its revolution. The civil war that happened in China then was between these two groups, the Chinese Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party. So I've used the word nationalist in a couple ways here. You might kind of sort that out. So nationalist, like say with a small n, just as a description, did describe the Chinese Communist Party because they also were against foreign businesses and foreign governments controlling places in China. But they were opposed to the Nationalist Party. Well, at first they cooperated with, then they fought the Chinese Nationalist Party. It's kind of the capital N. It's the word in like National People's Party. It's the words in Chinese because the communists also felt that China should destroy property and business ownership. So remember, communism means a lot more than equaling out like how much people get paid. Like I said, it means ending the ownership of productive land, like for farms, and ending the ownership of businesses. There's no more owners. And so the nationalists, like the nationalists say in Germany, were opposed to that. They didn't want to divide the Chinese people against amongst themselves. So wealthy landlords tended to support the nationalists, and poorer peasants tended to support the communists. This led to a civil war. The map on the left shows the pinkish areas there are where the communists had control around 1930, but then the nationalist army was able to destroy them, literally, and a few thousand surviving communists went on a long march. So the arrows here show this long march, which is one of the better named things in history because it was very long. It is thousands of miles. And so the Chinese Communist Party had its base down here in the south of China. But then from the long march, it walked all the way here to northern China. Like literally, they walked. It's during this time this person, Mao Zedong, became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So Mao then became the leader during this march. You can see the Civil War went on for a long time. It paused during World War II, mostly, and then resumed when the war ended. So China went through the warlord period without strong central government, and then 20 plus years of civil war, and that included World War II inside of it, and then fought in the Korean War a year after that. So it's really a quarter century of tragedy for people in China. So this would be the one slide where you might write a few things down that would help you later if you haven't already. And so this is the most important person's name in the slide, and that's Mao Zedong. And he established a new kind of communism that was based on the power of peasant people, in his eyes, to revolt and create the new communist society. This was something that hadn't happened quite that way anywhere else. So Mao was a communist. He didn't believe that anyone should own property. Like people might own their own things, but no one should own land or a business where someone else has to work. That's what communism would mean, so that everything is being worked together. And he was also very opposed to traditional Chinese culture, which he felt was holding Chinese people back. And so discrimination against women was part of that he wanted to overturn. Confucianism, various things that he would have viewed as superstitions. And he was not alone in these things. This part, though, is what made him different from other other communists around the world. Now, he did support collectivization, which meant that peasants would take over land and work it together as a collective. And he also believed, like the two people in the picture here, that peasants could be taught and could be led in a guerrilla war, I guess the hit and run and ambush, small war to fight against the capitalists and the national government. And so they organized in that long march, they organized this peasant army that would fight small battles and live with the peasants, and then also fight against the national government. So, communist revolution. And this is a strategy. This is important because then this strategy gets adopted after World War II by communists all around the world, in Vietnam, in Central America, in Angola. And so it becomes a big part of the second half of the 20th century, or especially the time period from like 1950 to 1975. So the third quarter of the 20th century. Yeah. Okay. So this is the Civil War in China. That's Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, and his wife, Madam Chiang, who was also a very important leader in her own right. And on the right, you see Mao Zedong and the People's peasant and workers' army, they called it. And you can see how they have a flag based on the Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle in it. When World War II happened, then Japan invaded China. We've already learned about some of that. So this civil war was already happening when those horrible events that you heard about in China, especially in Nanjing, were happening. So it was the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, that got chased out of Nanjing, and then when those horrible events happened there. But then during the war, the communists and the nationalists fought each other, or stopped fighting each other mostly, and fought against the Chinese, or against the Japanese. I'm sorry. So the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party united to fight against Japan. On the right, you see a propaganda poster from the nationalists. So they're against imperialism. And on the left, you see communist soldiers, but the flag they have is actually the flag of nationalist China. So they're fighting together. And that war involved tremendous suffering. So this map shows these different areas. The darker colors where Japan occupied. So up here's Manchuria, where the war started. And then Nanjing is here in Shanghai. And then these stripy areas out there, areas in the countryside where there was a lot of communist bases for operations, and they would fight guerrilla wars. The Japanese would come into the countryside and they would ambush them and then hide and fight this ongoing war that didn't force Japan to leave, but took a lot of their forces. As you know, Japan loses World War II, mostly because of the military actions by the United States and American allies like Australia and Britain. And you can see over here, the map on the lower left shows the area of Manchuria, which was where Japan originally took over to start the war. At the very end of the war, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Soviet Union didn't declare war on Japan until after the first atomic bomb was dropped. But in that time, they'd been getting ready. And so Soviet tanks poured into Japanese-controlled Manchuria at the end of the war. And since the Soviet Union was communist too, this gave the Chinese communists who were operating there a chance to gather their forces and start to attack not just the Japanese, but also other Chinese. So again, it can get kind of complicated, but the big idea here is that it was a hugely tragic, 2.5 decades. If you think of, the Red Army of the Soviet Union, the Japanese army, two different armies from the same country, all fighting each other in this area. So then after the war, we have the map over here shows you where the Chinese were based at when the communists were based when Japan was there. So then when the war ended, the Chinese Communist Party began fighting the nationalists again, except now they were better equipped.